Hi, this is Paul. You'll probably notice an interruption in my video output. You haven't noticed it yet unless you were paying attention that, well, I'm taking a little while to put out some of these things. Yeah, that's because I have a son getting married this weekend, so it's going to be a busy weekend. And I didn't take a vacation week, so I'm trying to do a whole bunch of things at the same time. Anyway, Cal Zeldin sent me this review on Astral Codex 10. That's Slate Star Codex Substack iteration. Is it on Substack? No, it's on its own website. Yeah, it is on Substack. Anyway, he's got his own domain on the Substack. Anyway, this of course is a familiar guy that's been around a lot. Bay Area therapist who sort of talks out of, in some ways, sort of the new rationality position. And he reviews a book in this, The Others Within, which I had never heard of. It gets into internal family systems and talks a little bit about it. Basically, the force of the piece is that, well, maybe I'll just read some of the piece. Internal family systems is the hot new psychotherapy. It has a secret. Hot new psychotherapy might sound dismissive. It's not. There's always one. The therapy that's getting all the buzz, curing all the incurable patients, rocking these first few small studies, the therapy was invented by a grizzled veteran therapist working with patients like you, not the out-of-touch elites behind all the other therapies. The therapy that really gets to the root of the problem. There's always one like that. Now it's IFS. In other words, this is the real stuff. Sufficiently new and popular therapies are hard to get. Therapists' training starts slowly. The founder has to train the second generation of therapists. The second generation has to train the third, and so on and so forth. It's almost apostolic succession in terms of these therapeutic models, it seems. IFS says they have 10,000 patient wait list for their training program. So lots of people have heard great things about IFS. Maybe read a manual or two, but never tried it or met anyone who has. What I gather from the manuals, IFS is about working with parts. You treat your mind as containing a self, a sort of perfect angelic intellect without any flaws or mental illness, and various parts like little subminds with their own agendas who can sometimes occlude or overwhelm the self. During therapy, you talk to the parts, learn their motives, and bargain with them. Now, if you listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson, you hear sort of an implicit... Gotta get my chair right. Sort of an implicit parts language. He talks about personalities as different things as sort of like many personalities, and we have all this wiring and machinery and programs. And so this parts language has been evolving for a while. For example, you might identify a part of you that wants to sabotage your relationships. You will visualize and name it. Maybe you call it Sabby, and she looks like a snake. You talk to Sabby and learn that after your first breakup, when you decided you never wanted to feel that level of pain again, you unconsciously created her and ordered her to make sure that you never got close enough to anyone else to get hurt. Then you and the therapist come up with a plan to satisfy Sabby. Maybe you convince her that you're older now and better able to deal with the pain, and you don't blame her if you get close to someone and have to break up again. Then you see a vision of Sabby stepping aside, maybe turning off the windmill of relationship sabotage or something like that, and then you never sabotage your relationships again. It's more complicated than that, but that's the core. Oh, this is the classic version everyone learns from the manual. Before we get to the secret, let's examine two big assumptions in more detail. First, it isn't supposed to be just the therapist walking you through guided imagery or you making up a story to tell yourself. The therapist asks you, look inside until you find the part that's sabotaging your relationship. And you are supposed to discover, not invent, that your unconscious gives it the form of a snake called Sabby. Now, I want to mention this video again. I mentioned it before. It's Ray Klauser from a number of years ago, and he's basically giving examples from math about his Christian philosophy. And basically what he says is that even every mathematical system and someone who is sufficiently advanced in math is going to have to get into the theoretical level to ask themselves what numbers are, what are behind numbers. Is there sort of a universe of numbers that our math is participating in? What exactly is behind mathematical numbers? And the point that he makes with this is generally the bigger point that he makes in his book, that everything, whether we're conscious or not, has certain assumptions underneath it, certain underpinnings. And sort of the way we go about things is that people sort of recognize that this is true. And of course, presuppositionalism has been about this for a very long time, that, well, there's certain theoretical underpinnings, and the more you work a system, the more you're actually going to begin to participate with those underpinnings, and the more those underpinning assumptions are going to sort of manifest until, let's say, if you get sufficiently good in math, then you get to the point of actually having to deal with the theory of math. I mean, you start just doing basic arithmetic, you learn a little geometry, you learn a little this, you learn a little that. At some point, you're going to have to get to the theory. Now, the idea, of course, is that, well, hopefully the more advanced you get, the more experienced you get, the theoretical underpinnings will begin to reveal themselves. But other things are revealing themselves in this process, according to this author. And according to Slate Star Codex, I don't know if he's still going by, what was Scott Alexander? I don't know if he's, this is a very credible man with a lot of history in his field. Anyway, let's keep going. So you're supposed to discover, not invent, discover that your unconscious gives in the form of a snake called Sabby. And you're supposed to hear, as in a trance, again, not invent, Sabby telling you that she's been protecting you from heartbreak since your last breakup. When you bargain with Sabby, it's a two-way negotiation. You learn, not decide, whether or not Sabby agrees to any of the given bargain. Now again, learn, not decide, discover, not invent. You begin to see that you're exposing underneath that, well, if there is a part of you that is really real, it's something you're going to discover, not something, not just, it's if you say, well, let's make up a story that gets at that part. There's still going to be a level of separation. I was listening to Russell Brand talk to Brett Weinstein, and there's always the separation with Brett, and he comes off in that interview as very professorial. Brett can tend to be very professorial often, but it's just sort of a distance, and that distance itself is part of the underlying assumptions. When you bargain with Sabby, it's a two-way negotiation. You learn, not decide whether or not Sabby agrees to any given bargain. According to internal family systems, which descends from normal family systems, i.e. family therapy, where the whole family is there at once and has to compromise with each other, all this stuff is in your head, waiting for an internal family systems therapist to discover it. When Carl Jung talked about interacting with the archetypes or whatever, he wasn't being metaphorical. He literally meant, yes, I know, I'm not going to escape the word, but I still can pause and consider better options than the L word. He literally meant going into a trance that gives you a sort of waking lucid dream where you meet all the internal stuff. After reading the Internal Family Systems Manual, I tried most of their tricks for initiating this sort of trance and meeting Sabby or whoever. I got nothing. I noticed most of the patients with great results are severely traumatized borderlines. For example, the same people who often get multiple personality disorder after the slightest hint from a therapist that this might be happening. We'll get back to this analogy later. The second assumption is that everything inside your mind is part of you. Again, there's these assumptions beneath. And everything inside your mind is good. And this tends to be sort of the modernist framework about reality. It's, if there is a spiritual world, well, then they're all good angels and good spirits and good things. But we're very skeptical about that, and we are ourselves severely buffered. So everything is inside your head, and everything is for the good. You might think of Sabby as some kind of hostile interloper, ruining your relationships with people you love. But actually, she's a part of your unconscious, which you have in some sense willed into existence, looking out for the best interests. You neither can nor should fight her. If you try to excise her, you will psychically wound yourself. Instead, you should bargain with her the same way you would another friend or a loved one, until either she's convinced that your relationships are bad, or you and the therapist together convince her that they aren't. This is one of the pillars of classical IFS. The secret is, no, actually some of the things are, and he says, literal demons. Now, this is where we sort of trigger modernist Cartesian Christianity versus secularism. Because secularism will say, no, it's all fantasies. Modernists will say literal demons, even though what really do you mean by that word? Because spiritual demons, actual is much more sort of time and locality. Why don't we just cut the word out together? And there are things, some of these things are demons, and just leave it there. Now, again, in the last video that I made about demons, you can find it. It wasn't last week or the week before that I made it. Part of what's going on is that just like the things underneath our conversations are changing, our imaginary with which we're using this language is changing. For example, when we talk about principalities and powers, when you talk about hyperobjects like communism, like capitalism, like evolution, and when you're talking about these waves that go through our culture, again, one of the most surprising things that I've had in the last 5 years, I should probably look it up and search the transcript, was hearing James Lindsay fairly early on in the whole woke war thing use the word demonic. Okay. So most people, if you say Hitler was demonic, they'll say, okay, well, demon is another word for evil, but just really evil. And often secular people use the word demonic in that way. I didn't get the sense that James Lindsay was using it quite that way. And I think in some ways he was using language, he was using programming that he hadn't really thought through. And I think that could very well still be the case. I'm going to end this video with a clip from this morning's Luke live stream where David gets talking about programming and possessions. And it's interesting the way that Dave is sort of using this, because a lot of what we're doing is recognizing that, well, we're using different metaphors for talking about what's going on inside of us. I mean, Jonathan Peugeot will talk about the fact that we are all this jumble of different needs and wants and personalities, and that there are many within us. And what we look to do is integrate and become sort of one thing. Now, with this internal family systems, they're sort of getting below the surface and finding things. And part 2. At least this is what I take from The Others Within. That's this book by Robert Falconer, a veteran IFS therapist. But it's not just Falconer saying this, because again, you might say, well, maybe some crazy Christian started doing this, and so they've got the presuppositional worldview that would call these things demons. And if a secularist was just running this show, then none of this would happen. Doesn't seem to be the case. It's not just Falconer saying this. The book was forwarded by Richard Schwartz, the inventor of IFS, where he basically endorses it. It has cover blurbs from some high-ranking IFS trainers. My impression is that everyone high in IFS believed something like this, some as metaphor, other as reality. I'm just going to stop using that word, because that word, I mean, I know some of you are like, give it up on that word, but no, our use of that word is a tell about what's going on in terms of our broader culture. They avoided talking about it lest it scare away the normies. Why? Because the normies, everyone, we've sort of, with modernity, had this. In my sermon, I was talking about Durkheim's social facts. We've had social facts that have basically said if you say the word demon as something other than really bad, you will be beyond the pale. That's ending. That's what I mean by the recession of modernity. I don't mean modernity is going away. I just mean the assumptions of modernity are ending and will no longer be able to be held collectively, communally, as social facts, sort of in this certain level that we call normal. Falconer got tired of keeping quiet and wrote the book, and everyone has decided to come clean and support him instead of denying anything. You can see signs of the political fractures throughout the book. It often tries to soften the blow by replacing demons with the technical IFS term UBS for unattached burdens, and it consistently calls exorcisms unburdenings. It flirts with the idea that maybe it is just a useful metaphor, then veers off into, no, it's literally real. No, it's real. See, you can just skip that word, and the sentence is actually better. I want to stress that the reality is Falconer's position, not necessarily that of the mainstream IFS. Its alternatives, it alternates between apologetic and defiant. But the underlying narrative is a consistent one. The IFS community was a bunch of normal, respectable therapists trying to practice normal therapy. But every so often, one of their patients' parts would admit unprompted to being a demon, or, in the words of such an entity, no, I'm not part of her. I'm a much more powerful and beautiful being, and I'm going to crush her like a worm the same way I'm going to crush you. If the story about Sabby is a typical IFS session, there's an atypical one. Now, was Jesus practicing ISF? He comes into the synagogue and boom, somebody's internal family what is it called? Unattached burden manifests itself. Another patient comes to you, once again asking for help because they're sabotaging their relationship. You ask them to go into a trance and find the part of them involved. They meet a dragon named Damien. So far, so good. You ask Damien why he's sabotaging the patient's relationships, expecting to hear a beautiful story about how the patient's mother was a doormat, and this made the patient unconsciously charge a part of herself with protecting her own independence or something. Instead, Damien says he's sabotaging them because fuck you. This isn't unheard of. Some of these traumatized parts are really touchy. But the therapist persists and gets the same answer. On further questioning, Damien admits he's not part of the patient's unconscious at all. He's an external spiritual entity that entered the patient. Again, this is atypical, okay? And I really want to stress that. Later on, Scott Alexander will go through and say, be really, really careful with this stuff because there's this, again, another fancy therapist word, the question of, we'll go full Grim Grizz here.
Iatrogenic.
Induced unintentional by a physician or surgeon or by a medical team or the diagnostic procedure. It's an illness or an injury.
Iatrogenic.
And again, this has been pretty much known, and this is standard training in like theological seminary like mine that didn't disbelieve in demons but said this kind of stuff is very rare. But again, things are changing when we begin to understand spirits as not just sort of having a substance ontology, but spirits in other ways and demons in other ways. And again, I'm not saying demons aren't real. I'm just saying, when Martin Luther threw an inkwell at a demon, the demon didn't say, "Ooh, that hurt." Because, well, we don't know. Because inkwells and demons aren't going to collide like me and a demon. With enough questioning, the entity will reveal more information. Some of them are spirits of the unquiet dead. In one case, a victim described how she was in a hospital and the patient next to her died, and she developed sudden onset anxiety. In her IFS trance, she realized that the anxiety took the form of a dead patient. Others have always been demons as long as they can remember. Still, they are legacy burdens who were passed down from the patient's parents or ancestors. Falconer tries to give the last one a scientific grounding by talking about epigenetics, which broke my suspension of disbelief. Talk about demons and I'll listen. Talk about intergenerational epigenetic inheritance of behavioral traits is a step too far for Scott Alexander. The demons often enter the victim during moments of unbearable trauma. The patient, bent on the breaking point, has a moment of weakness when it will take help from any corner, let in anything that offers temporary relief, no matter how unconvincing. Most of these are situations you'd expect, child abuse, rape, but a surprising number of them say it got in them during childhood surgery. Falconer is appropriately puzzled and wonder if it made the disembodiment of anesthesia provides an opening. And again, I mean, Peugeot keeps saying things are going to get wild. This is the wild. It's right here. Because we're not just going to sort of switch back to a medieval perspective. We can't do that. We've been through modernity, but, in terms of Nate Heil's conversation with Brandon Dempsey Graham, neither is it going to be just simply assuming the modernist perspective. It's going to be realizing that modernity affords certain kinds of knowledge, but not other kinds of knowledge. And then off this goes. And once inside, the demons feed on energy, usually a form of negative emotions. They farm the energy by causing negative emotion, either by directly engaging in negative self-talk about the victim or tricking them into bad decisions. Many demons feed on lust and sexual violence and tempt patients into risky sexual behavior. Falconer moots this as one reason that people float from one abuser or rapist to another. He also reports that the demons claim, once again, self-reported data from demons is questionable for at least two reasons. You should assume demons know how to lie. To be able to lend their victims extra sexual energy, giving them crazy girls or hot effect again. The first N times they ran into this kind of thing, the IFS therapist said that this surely is some good, albeit traumatized part of the patient's unconscious, which had spun a crazy metaphorical story and needed to be bargained with and brought back to self. But it kept happening. The demon stories were surprisingly consistent. Finally, some of the IFS therapists would tell their therapist friends, look, this sounds crazy, but sometimes it seems like our patients have demons. And the therapist friends would answer, oh, you too? Falconer says many therapists know that this is a part of their work. They know this stuff is real, but they try to hide it. Every so often, one of them goes public, occasionally starting a new therapy branch or reworking old ones. Falconer surveys some of these traditions and then goes into a bunch of names. We had Ralph Allison named in our conversation with Cale and Bethel. Scott Peck, a name that will hit a bunch of people. Then he tells missionary stories. And then goes through kind of a, number one, confirm it's really a demon, because this is important. Most parts, even the most hostile parts that tell you on a loop to kill yourself or whatever, really are just traumatized pieces of your own mind. Trying to exercise them will only make them angry and delay your healing process. This is a pillar of the original IFS formulation, one of Dr. Schwartz's original book called No Bad Parts. Luckily, demons apparently have to tell the truth about this, ? If you ask them point blank whether or not they're a demon, they'll try to stall and dither. But if you really press the question, they'll almost always admit to it. Apparently, they like to talk about themselves and explain themselves. And there's nothing actually unbiblical about that, because whatever. So, yeah. And where are people going to look for relief from this? They're not going to look for it in the hospital. They're going to look for it from a priest or a pastor or a church. So it's a long piece. I'm just offering it to you as information. Folks out there are going to read it differently. But again, my point in this is not to just say, oh, let's dunk on the materialists. My point is that, again, modernity is receding. The self seems not nearly as buffered as experts said it was 20, 30 years ago, or at least would admit to saying it was. And now this next piece that I'm going to play, I'm just going to play it because I have no time. I'm just going to attach it on here, is just a fascinating piece because David has sort of taken up this idea of programs. And now, again, I think all of us will consider this, well, is it metaphorical? In some ways, it's very much a metaphor because we are not computers. We are not meat computers. But there is a dynamic that is similar to programming that we take on. And then he sort of switches it to possession and say, well, I'm sort of possessed by this and I'm sort of possessed by that. And again, we have to be really careful with that language because we use it sort of colloquially. Well, I'm sort of possessed with finding figuring out which camera I want to take to my trip to Italy this summer. There. But I don't mean that there is a demon in me that is working on camera obsession for me to figure out how to both pack lightly and to not miss the opportunity to see some of the most important and amazing art from the Renaissance and before and beyond. So there'll be a blank in videos this summer too, unless I can figure out how to upload some things and maybe share some stuff, probably on the member section of what I'm finding, what I find in Italy. Again, I'm by no means just trying to. Part of what I get frustrated by is this conversation is handled with such low resolution. Because what tends to happen is, and again, this is classic modernity pressures. Either you're going to be some crazy religious person that's going to just say, well, I believe in demons, but then there's all sorts of modernistic assumptions down beneath that we actually have within this term. And some of those things are being undermined and eroded, even though the category remains. And then there are others that are going to jump in and say, well, this is just the typical crazy talk of you. And then they're going to sort of run the New Atheist code and run the New Atheist program. And I'll agree with David. I think his metaphor is pretty apt. I've got all of this programming in my head. And Sam at one point says, yeah, even Paul Vanderklay says he reads certain passages of the Bible and he hears Sam in his head. That's right. I usually use the metaphor of a consciousness congress. And, or I can use, there's a little Sam Tiedemann program in my head, and there's programs for my kid and my wife and all of these things. And then there are pieces of me and parts of me that are sort of, bump into each other. And if something happens, it's funny if something happens, especially someone that let's say it's your wife would say, I've noticed that in these certain situations, you're sort of this way. And that's kind of funny because you're not usually that way. Why are you that way in those kinds of situations? Now, for me, these little situations are pretty nuanced, but most people wouldn't say, well, there's a demon inside you that makes you feel uncomfortable in situations X and Y. I would look at that and say, well, it's probably psychological because situations X and Y are pretty tame. I'm not going to go into this into much depth, but they're very benign, very strange things that it's like, just strange things that my wife knows and that probably almost nobody else does know. So I'm not going to share them on the internet. They're not sexual in any way, I'll tell you that. But there's just funny little quirks about me that after 36 years of marriage, my wife just says, that's a strange thing. And of course, I've got my list about her too. So again, the main message of this video is not that demons are real. They are. The main message of this video is that John Vervaeke for sure has a demon. I certainly can't say that. Or that Hermes is a demon, because a bunch of you will rush to judgment with respect to these things. My point is that now with the recession of modernity, things are going to get strange indeed. And it may very well be that spirits of one way or another, at various levels or another, you could say that the Soviet Union was possessed by the spirit. The Soviet Union as a body was possessed by the spirit of communism, or the demon of communism, or the prince of communism, sort of working from the book of Daniel and the prince of Persia. Because sort of what happened in modernity is that demons became these things that sort of, occupy people one at a time, because those are the kinds of things you could find in the Bible. And then when we looked at principalities and powers, we said, oh, well, maybe they're bigger ones, but we really didn't have any category for them. And now as we're sort of understanding scaling of bodies and scaling of agencies and all of these kinds of things, well, then things just get weirder still. So, yeah. So again, I'm just going to then play this other clip from Luke and then maybe put a little branding so that the little things that YouTube likes to do at the end of my videos can be done and not step over the conversation. And I'll put a link to that conversation on Luke's channel so that you can go back and watch the whole thing, because it was quite a bit longer. And I got to run. Leave a comment. I probably will.
I've been thinking recently in the ability to see my wife will do things, and now I use this expression, which is run program, which is like one time she wanted to make this salad, and like it was a Greek salad, but she wanted to throw avocado in it for some reason because we had some that was going bad. And I made the salad completely, but didn't include the reason why we made it, which was to use the avocado. And she's like, but I said that's why. And I said, no. I just ran the Greek salad program. I just turned it on. And then as soon as I run that program, and like we've had these conversations, because so much of your day is actually choosing which programs to run. And as soon as you hit play on those programs, then it just goes through. And that's when I stop thinking. That's when I plug the earbuds in and I can do whatever. Yep. I can do some of my work, my day job, while I'm listening to however many complicated podcasts. Yeah. That's completely fine when I'm running the program of my work. Yeah. But then sometimes I have to hit pause and actually focus, and then I can see things.
No, and that's a perfect illustration of Peterson will talk about this, Jordan, when he's talking about how we build in neural networking. And it's the same thing as subsidiary focal integration. It's what Polanyi's talking about, is you pay attention when you're learning a new skill. You have to focally pay attention to it with your prefrontal cortex so that you can learn this skill. You have to give it attention. But then once you've given it attention and you've integrated it, you've built a neural pathway into your subconscious, and then you can run the program. Then you don't have to pay attention to it, and you can pay attention
now
to
I don't else. That's right. Yeah. And that in and of itself affects how we see details, to what extent we're able to see things.
Yeah, totally. Right? And I guess that's probably kind of my argument. It's almost like that people intellectually so much are just running programs. They're just repeating knowledge or models over and over and over. This is why it just bothers the shit out of me when people just reference intellectuals and just quote them. And I'm just like, do you have any thoughts of your own? Because if you're just repeating people, you probably don't understand things in the way that you ought to understand them, in the way that I'm talking about. Really.
You're the biggest quoter in the corner. You always quote.
Yes, but okay.
Well, let's see how this goes. Is like we have these conversations about possession as like an entirely negative thing. But I think that when you include the notion of the Holy Spirit and everything else, that possession is actually like a regular part of life. That it's like I become possessed when I clean my house, right? I become focused and I just do the one thing while not doing the other thing. And it's like you have to take these breaks to make decisions as to what you're letting in, because most of our lives necessarily cannot be always like noticing everything all the time.
No.
I have to, run. I mean, even because I've had this conversation to some extent with my wife, I'm right now in this conversation running the program of the conversations about running programs I've had twice before.
Yeah.
Right? Like right now I'm doing it and being pulled out of it because I'm realizing that even this conversation is a program.
Yeah, completely. And that's like what Peugeot, we've mentioned that a ton about Peugeot is, Paul will talk about that. When he first started listening to Peugeot, he couldn't make sense of what he was talking about at all. But then he got used to it. He habituated himself to it. He focused on it, repeated it, and it was initiated into it. And then he could understand what he was talking about.
Yeah. And I just when we got onto this topic, wanted to jump in because I totally agree. It was funny. Sunday, I talking to a friend from church about everything I did, and went to church, served, did all this stuff, went home, packed for a trip, went back out with friends, and and he's like, wow, it's cool that you did all that. That's awesome that you were able to get all that done. And it was funny because I was like, yeah, but that's just the meta program of being part of this community of they're making it easy. And there's even sub programs of I learned, I got a city bike membership, which is you can rent a bike. And that means instead of a 20-minute bus ride to my friend's house, it's actually a 7-minute bike ride. But I didn't make city bike. I didn't there's this whole little world and all these things integrate together that are, some person who works for the city made this program. So all these different meta programs that aren't even at my level, I'm not at the substrate to affect those. It's the church community and the pastor and the city planner and the people who designed New York City 200 years ago. They're all coming together to make it so that these things can get accomplished. But growing up, there's so much of this, at least in suburban America that I experienced, there's so much you're doing it. You need to study, you need to do these things. And it's yeah, that's not how humans work. You can't just be run program 90-hour work week, run program, get a perfect score on SAT, it's that's not the correct level of analysis.
And the program itself does not evaluate whether or not the program is a good program.
Yeah.
Right. And that became a big conversation I've had with my wife, because I don't know what needs to be cleaned in the house. So when I clean the house, I have to consult my wife what is important right now? Because when we first got married, she says something was important, and that just became the only thing I did when I was cleaning the house. And she's like, no, this also needs to be done. Yes, but what level of importance is that?
Yeah.
I can run Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. And if you have company coming over, that changes the hierarchy. If you, if you do this, if you start, using one part of the house more, that changes all this. And, why are you using that part of the house more? And, so there's all these levels of, at which you need to offload that decision-making process because it becomes too complicated, because cleaning your house is actually connected to every other part of your life. Sorry to cut you off. Continue, David.
No. That's big. I completely agree.
Hezzy just disappeared. I was going to see what he had to say. What up, buddy?
I gotta get gas. I'm just going to jump back on.
Okay.
When friends come over, wife says, run entire house cleaning program. And then I fail.
Well, for my wife, I can tell when she's especially stressed, because inappropriate programs begin to be run. So we have to go and she starts cleaning something. And I'm like, uh-oh, that program shouldn't be played right now. That's like the indication. I mean, you can see people even as they start fidgeting, right? Like if you have a conversation with someone and they're really anxious, they'll start like cleaning their nails or something like that. Even biting your nails is like essentially a program. It's nails are too long. And so you can see when you're even just having a regular conversation with someone, they'll start, it's like even biting nails is a kind of program that then deals with things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but at the same time, that same stress can be the thing that gets you to do the correct or correct is a relative term, but I haven't cleaned my house in a while, and you're like, I should clean it, but you don't. And then finally it's like, I have a friend coming over or my parents are coming by. Then that stress actually gets you to run the program.
Right. But again, because it doesn't evaluate the program, one of my experiences, an ex-girlfriend had a possible self-harm attempt and had to be put in the hospital, but she felt that this was like that nothing had actually happened. And so she's there waiting for doctors, and it was just like a terrifying experience for her. And she starts biting her nails. And once she's done what would be like a proper length of nails, she does it again and does it again. And like her nails start bleeding because she's pulling so much of it. Because again, you're not evaluating the importance of the program. The anxiousness almost says must run some sort of program. I must do something with this energy. And so she starts running programs that are not good, right? Like you can see that as like within people's regular lives could result in self-harm, could result in all sorts of things, running programs that should not be run.
Exactly. But this, I think, gives you such an opportunity to appreciate people the way Christ wants us to like see people, because you realize that they are like the managers of these programs, and that is actually the meta skill that's actually important, of like just having a 180 IQ, having these things. Like that person could go off and become, do the thing that invents the bomb that kills everybody, the AI that actually program. You think like, 180 IQ, like how many computations per second are they doing? Like, that must be good. This computer does more computations a second than this other computer.
Okay, I want to make a quick point, and then Chezi, when he's done pumping his gas, can make a point. So Chad keeps saying we're people, not computers, not programs. It's all, Chad, here's where I'll challenge you, my buddy, and of your criticism of me earlier. Hold on to words like icons. Don't get caught up in the myopia of the word. Because you can say programs, you can say habits, you could say whatever. If you see the thing behind the thing, God is he about whom we must never speak, and we must always keep speaking. Don't get caught up in the word, And I could say simultaneously that I am not doing regurgitative knowledge when I reference people and quote people, and that can be true or it can not be true. You can be right and be wrong, or wrong and right.
Well, and it, like at an extreme version, we get into conversations about addiction, where for some people, if they have one drink, then they run the Bender program, right? And so it's like, if I do this thing, then it's like hitting play on a song, and we don't get to stop the song until the song is over.
Right. Or it's just a habit, or it's spiritual possession. Call it whatever you want.
Right.
Chezi, what up?
Praise the Lord. Thank God. Doing well. I hope you guys are all doing well as well. It's good to see you. I might need a little more on ramping. I'm not exactly sure about this program narrative you're talking about.
Well,
he's running the confusion program, guys.
Well, and it's like when you drive, people have noted that when you drive home, that's when you're most likely, when you're 5 minutes away from home, is when you're most likely to get into an accident. Well, the reason why is because you're not actually watching. You're just doing the stuff. You're just driving, and most of that is not thinking. And that's also why entire like periods of time can go away, right? When I was busiest at work, when I worked at a movie theater, is when it felt like there was like your shift went by in no time at all. because there was no thinking, no anything. When you're just standing around having to make small talk with other people, that can be like pulling teeth. But being very, very busy is either horrible, or you get fully into the program and you don't even notice what has happened.
Mm-hmm.
I guess in that context, and you'll correct me if I'm if I'm correct, but in that context, I would say Judaism really fills your day with a tremendous amount of programs throughout the whole day.
Yes. Yeah, look, any liturgical faith would. And
Correct.
to that extent, I can say the Hail Mary in about 5 seconds because I grew up Catholic. I can say the Hail Mary without thinking about a single word that I'm saying. So am I even praying? I don't know.
So that's a great point. Something I mentioned to Jacob in the past, which is when I pray on, like when I'm in synagogue on Saturday, I pray with an English prayer book. And the reason I do this is because my program, so to speak, goes on automatic the second I open up the prayer book.
Right.
And I could be thinking to myself, Chazi, today you're taking your time and you're going to think and you're going to focus. By the time that thought is done, I already finished the prayer.
Right.
And I told myself like I'm going to do it. So the English, I mean, I read English as well, but like it's not as natural to me. So that sort of slows me down, right? So I'm trying to like do that to my programming to make sure that it stays fresh and I could interact with it. However, generally speaking, again, from the second you wake up, your whole as a Jewish person, just with regards to like all the different aspects of how Jewish law affects your life. It's really, like I've always mentioned in the past, from putting on your shoes, right? So it is the day itself goes automatically into your program, and very much, I mean, obviously this seeps into your morality and ethics, right? So the way I'm going to engage with the world, or the way I'm going to even read the news, first goes through that filter of my religious program.
Right.
Sorry.
What's up, Alan?
Hey, Ezzy. With that, there's sort of, in my mind, two sides. There's like run program, but there's also the like getting behind it or updating the program. What would you say is like the other side of the coin of like, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, like I'll just run the program versus like I need to sit back and like consciously think about the programs that are running?
So I have a point on that I think is really interesting, because it's like when I heard Rogan talk about martial arts, and he would say that very often the hardest people to train in martial arts are the people who have a fair degree of experience but have learned something incorrectly, because they have a really, really hard time unlearning the habit or the pattern or the program or whatever word you want to use.
And that's the criticism of religious people, right?
Yeah.
Like the notion
Exactly
of being closed-minded and everything else is, well,
Yes.
everything's going to be in this thing. And so, I mean, maybe TLC is actually like MMA is like, all right, throw everyone into the ring together and let's see if Kung Fu actually works. Uh-oh, it doesn't, right? It works fine as long as everyone is doing Kung Fu. But as soon as you have someone doing jujitsu, it's terrible, right? Like that no longer does anything.
Yeah. But at the same time, Peugeot talked about this same idea. And Hezi, I do want to get your answer to that question. But Peugeot talked about in one of his podcasts about ritual fighting. And the reason you get ritual fighting is because you don't actually kill everybody. That like if wolves like submit and roll over and then one pretends to bite the other's neck, not everyone has to die every time there's a beautiful she-wolf for whatever they're fighting over.
Right.
So,
but then it becomes dance. Then it becomes dance if it's all ritual.
Well, it's interesting because it's like, do you want everything to become total war? Do you want like the MMA fight to be like, okay, well, this MMA fight is going to occur all across the US. There's no boundaries. All across the world, you can use any weapons you want. You can, and everyone's involved. And like at the end, when everyone's dead but one person, we'll have the ultimate fighting champion. The
Highlander.
Yeah, we'll have like even the UFC needs rules, and and I get your point about like we could say that like UFC is more of a pure understanding of the god of combat. but that there's multiple of these spirits that need to be balanced, and that something like Kung Fu is more of like this god that's been integrated into culture and ritual and dance and entertainment. I guess UFC obviously is an entertainment, but yeah, but like all of them apply. You can't just have total war of like, okay, well, this guy sewed a gun to his hand, so that's part of his body, so he gets to use the gun in the UFC fight. That's the rules. He surgically had it attached, so that's part of it. You eventually have to say, no, you can't just surgically change your arm for a gun, and then you're the greatest UFC fighter of all time.
You could just identify as always winning.
Yeah.
Alan, to your question, I think this also relates to sort of like the meta modern conversation. Sorry, Chad, if we're mentioning that again. Which is, and at the time, Mr. Brendan mentioned about toggling. So here too, the reason the program needs to get, like, there's me living the program, and then, like you said, me getting behind the program. That only happens once, there's a glitch, so to speak, right? So I always talk about how Judaism is like a great operating system, but after 2,000 years, like, the iOS needs to be updated, getting behind sort of that program. And you, again, I and this is something I was talking about with Tunji, also in this little space. I feel personally, and I you guys could illuminate for me how it is in Christianity, but I feel that in Judaism, there are many different systems that I could decide to upload based on the scenario I'm in. So I was having a conversation with my grandfather, and it was a very rationalist conversation we were having, very Maimonides. And then I sort of whipped out this like mystical interpretation. And my grandfather was like, what are you talking about? Like, where is this from? And I said, like, Grandpa, like right now I'm engaging with you the way you like to engage, like from this rationalist perspective. But I have a whole nother system I could run, which allows me to like now avoid this problem that you just presented me. And I could just switch into that system. So I don't necessarily feel like there's a need to update constantly. Rather, I feel like there's a need to be able to jump between or toggle between different systems. So I don't know if that's possible though in Christianity, where like, for example, this might sound like a little extreme. We have Sam over here, so this is why I'm mentioning it. And hey, Sam, I hope you're doing well. If a Trinitarian was in a crisis of faith, would it be smart for him, or would it be possible for him to have a Sam Titteman theology in his back pocket for those moments?
Kezi, do not ask this question. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I won't ask this question. So don't go there, Kezi. So I would say that would sort of be a move where, like, okay, I'm in an issue right now, but I know that there's still another route that has already solved this issue, or a program that allows me to deal with a scenario.
The problem is that I don't think belief at the more fundamental level, belief versus thinking, I don't think you choose. I don't think you can just will and just be like, I'm going to just adopt Sam's belief for now.
I think you can to some extent, though. To me, if you're like a moment of clarity or whatever, that there is this slight ability to make choices between which program you're going to run. Because I've definitely had that experience with people where it's just like, depending on what words I use, they will run different programs. And so I can make you make a decision as to how offensive something is going to be. And I just select which words. And by selecting those words, I'm deciding which program even they are running, right? If I use specific words, they're going to go, what? Or they're going to say, oh, he wants me to know he's smart and we're supposed to run a smart program or something like that.
So when I'm speaking to Muslims, I will try to, I will take on the program with those sages and those texts, which allow me then to still see Muhammad as a prophet, still be able to say, inshallah, still be able to say peace be upon him. Now, there are other programs I run, which I can't do that. They're not interested in that sort of mindset. And I could say when I'm walking with my son to synagogue right now, that program doesn't be running because it's not relevant. However, when I'm dealing with a Muslim right now, that's instead of stuttering or being like, error, I don't know what to do right now. The attitude would be, okay, this is when I turn on program Judaism Muslim 2.0 that gives me the options right now to converse, talk, and see. And then based on where that discussion goes, it's also sort of by your fruits you'll know them. If it proves to be fruitful, then there's something there in a certain sense, right? If I'm now talking across the globe with all the Arab imams, then you'd be like, oh, maybe it was a right move to pull that programming on. Because if I kept on, if I decide to just use the program that sees Muhammad as an infidel, then that's one way of peace. We could do that.
Okay. So I want to hear what Sam has. I was going to bring up Jordan Peterson's free will argument because I think that's pertinent to this. Is like in the moment of a decision of an action, there actually isn't free will, which I think Jordan Peterson illustrates very well. But anyhow, Sam, we can maybe go there.
I think that a lot of Christians don't like having multiple programs or would view that with suspicion. I think that in my experience, especially among like evangelical Protestants, they like having kind of one answer and one operating system that's supposed to be able to do everything. And sort of that operating system is like flat. Like you were talking about, I can talk as a materialist or I can talk in like a mystical level. And I think that a lot of Protestants don't like multi-levels. Some of that has to do with the Catholic Church using a lot of allegorical interpretation to back up the things that the Protestants didn't like about the Catholic Church. And so that sort of left a bad taste for allegorical or mystical interpretation in Protestantism's mouth. Because it's like, you can use that stuff to defend anything because the Catholics used it to defend anything. But I like what you're saying, Hezi. I think that I think Thomas Jefferson said something like, the sign of intelligence is a person who can hold multiple competing beliefs in their head without deciding between them, or something along those lines. So
isn't that, and Luke just and then come in, but I mean, a rabbi that I mention often, his name is Rabbi Cook. He spoke about, and this is a very rough paraphrasing over here, but how fortunate are we that God has gifted his divine spark to multiple nations, basically, so we could all sort of learn from each other, right? So now that is, I could still feel unique as a Jew while maintaining that program, which recognizes the uniqueness of other people as well. And I would say for Christians, and this is part of like the deconstruction, or let's say part of TLC conversation is, and why I think this space is so great, is by hook or by crook, you are being exposed to different programs. So whether you want to or not, I believe someone that, like, people have heard too much of Sam Tiedemann to be, and they know that he's not a lunatic. So that's a problem. That's like a tension for people because they have to realize now this is, I may disagree with it, but I can't ignore it. And I would argue that at moments of doubt, that program starts seeping in.
Mm-hmm.
Vanderklay has admitted as such that occasionally the Sam Tiedemann program starts running when he's reading a certain verse or something like that.
Right.
Well, see, this is where, to my point, though, earlier, what I was saying at the beginning monologue, that's all within your, what I would call the egoic intellect, or your analytical thinking. So anytime you're doing that consciously, you're thinking about things and it's a left brain mode, and there's a deeper, more fundamental thing, which is where belief is operative, which is what Jordan Peterson's on all the time, which is where the right brain is the master. You can't will it. But you can choose to run that program.
Peterson is a great example because he's done the lectures that he's done so many times that someone will ask him a question and he'll just be like, run program related to whatever psychologist or whatever idea he recently came across. And then he'll almost use identical words, right? Yeah. He'll just start saying stuff. And it's just like, I know right now he's not actually individually thinking about each sentence because I've heard him say identical sentences in a row before. That's not to say he's not thoughtful or that he's not interested, or and sometimes you can even catch people where they will contradict themselves because they haven't figured out a way. Sometimes the programs do contradict each other. And I do think that some of our growth is supposed to be, okay, how do I include this into some of my thinking? How do I make this not merely I can switch from one to the other and contradict myself, which there's some level of maturity from that. But there's another level, which is, can I make these things actually somehow not contradict each other? Is there a way of incorporating these ideas, or do they just tear themselves apart?